Greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. Today I have an assortment of terrifying encounters to share with you. And when I say assortment, I really don't mean like the regular encounter after encounter. I've got some things today that are going to make you go, Before we get into that, though, a couple links. As you know, I rely on my Patreon, my PayPal, and my merch store to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Those links are in the description below. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters Volume 1, 2, and 3, the audiobook version. They were written by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeffrey Nadolny. They're available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, and the links to those books are in the description as well. Now, everyone, I've taken enough of your time. Let's get on with today's upload, shall we? Today's first encounter. So I live in Kentucky in a city now, but we lived way out in the country when I was younger in a very old giant farmhouse. My family got it for cheap because it was falling apart and the basement would flood and have crawfish infestations because it was so old. The basement floor was basically dirt and mud. I was also abducted at that house twice, but that's another story for another time. My dad and I would go on walks across the property to our neighbor's pond to fish. He allowed us free access. The neighbor also owned a herd of cattle. Well, one day we were walking there, and at the top of a very tall tree, it had to have been 40 to 50 feet off the ground, there was a young calf, quite simply impaled on one of the top branches. It had not been stormy for days, so it could not have been a freak tornado. This was over 20 years ago, but I will never forget that moment. It was one of the things that have convinced me that there is so much to this world that we do not understand. Today's second part of the upload. I was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, out in the desert. There was a band of pronghorn, and I started running toward them. Then there was this coyote, but it was unnatural. It stood on its hind legs for a split second. It bolted. I'm sitting there with my Henry repeater in my hand, and I'm thinking I'm going after that. I start tracking the paw prints, and it went from all four coyote prints to a weird, unidentifiable print, like a human foot was mixed with a coyote paw. Then it shifted to 2 feet, and I saw it in front of me. I took 2 shots. I put 1 round of a .44 rimfire in this thing's neck. Not even a flinch. I missed the other shot. That's when it kind of clicked in, like I'd realized this was a shapeshifter of some sort. And that's not normal, so I got the hell out of there. Today's third part of the upload. A few years ago, I was out turkey hunting by myself. I was camped in the forest in northern Arizona. The second night I was there, I had made a fire and dinner, and then went to bed in my tent. After the sun set, I could hear all the normal sounds of the forest at night, and I could hear an elk bugling, maybe a half a mile or a mile off. As I'm lying in my tent, I suddenly became aware that everything around me became dead quiet. All the noises I had been hearing previously had stopped, even the elk. It was then, from the same direction of the elk, I heard 2 long howls, like I've never heard in my life. It wasn't the elk, and it was not coyotes or any other animal that I know of, far off and loud, louder than the elk, but you could tell it was still far away. No one to my knowledge was camped anywhere near either. I've been in these woods my entire life, and I've never heard anything like that. I was also camped near a dry creek bed, and when I was lying there I could hear something walking through the leaves not far from my tent. I lied still and kept listening. I finally hit the lock button for my car, and it made the beeping sound, and the noise stopped. It could have been an animal, but I don't know. I lied there for about an hour, quiet and still, and it took almost 30 minutes for the sounds of the forest to come back. The next day I was hunting in a field, and I was sitting in a grove of trees. In this field there were no trees, around maybe 30 to 40 yards in each direction, and the grove was at the bottom of a little hill about 5 feet high. Out of nowhere, a rock comes rolling down the hill like it had been thrown. It landed maybe 10 to 15 feet away from me. It freaked me out, and I left the grove I was sitting in and went to the top of the hill within a few seconds or so, and there was absolutely nothing. I don't think a person could have thrown that rock and made it back to the tree line in seconds. And it would have had to have been a heck of a throw from 35 to 45 yards away. Not impossible, though. I'm Native American, and we are all taught about Bigfoot, and he is sacred and can travel through different worlds, and that if he wants to show himself to you, he will, and there is a meaning behind that. I left some spiritual food and said some prayers and moved on. I never did get that turkey either. Today's fourth encounter. I was riding with my mother in our Suburban. I was 17 at the time. It was around 10 p.m. at night with little traffic. It was icy at the time, so we were traveling pretty slow, somewhere around 20 to 30 miles an hour. There is, or was, one light there on the corner of the intersection across from the lake. What we saw was some sort of canine creature which passed only maybe 20 feet in front of us, which remained completely pitch black in the light of the streetlight and the headlights of the Suburban. Besides this oddity, the creature had legs, not including its body, taller than the hood of the SUV. It most definitely was not a deer or a moose, as both of us had, of course, seen those, and were very familiar. The shape of it was all wrong. The extra oddity is, it was big enough to cross the entire 4-lane road, with a median in the center in about 4 leaps. It stopped briefly, standing directly underneath the light pole on the intersection street, which is when both of us got our best look at it. Even directly under the light, there was nothing but pure black creature. I don't have an explanation for such a large creature in the area. I've lived there 17 years, and neither me nor my mother had ever witnessed anything of that sort. It shocked us both, and to this day, I don't have a clue of what it was. And to be honest, the thought of whatever it is makes me very uncomfortable, if for no other reason than just the size of it. This also happened 10 years ago in Andover, Minnesota. Today's fifth encounter. Hello everyone. So up until last year, I didn't believe Bigfoot existed at all, not even a thought in my head. Last year, me and my brother went backpacking in Nicollet National Forest, just west of Eagle River, Wisconsin, on their Hidden Lakes Trail. We hiked a little ways in and stayed the first night with nothing at all, just a normal backpacking trip. Then on the second night, we were tired and didn't want to hike any further, so we left the trail and took a road down to a campsite, accessible from the road but not from the trail. During the day, there was a ton of wind, and we even hung some clothes up to dry. They were dry in under an hour. Once night came along, the wind completely died down, and there was zero wind at all. We went to bed at around 11 p.m. While we were trying to fall asleep, we heard the usual noises of the woods, including wolves howling, and then we started to hear what sounded like wood knocking. It was coming from different spots in the woods, and it was almost like there were gaps between the knocks as well. Some were different pitches as well, almost like they were made with different pieces of wood. Then I fell asleep and slept through the next part, but according to my brother, he woke up around 4 a.m. and what sounded like a massive tree fell just outside of our campground, to the point that he was worried it could have hit us. He said when the tree fell, all the squirrels in the area began to chirp and go crazy from all directions, and they all stopped at the same time, and the forest was dead quiet again. The next morning, when we got up, he was telling me about it, and we were talking about the weird knocking sounds and couldn't figure out what it was. We ended up banging our own logs against trees to confirm that it was 100% the noise we heard. On our drive home after our trip, we looked up as much information as we could on the Squatch, and a lot of our stuff seemed to match up with data. I'm still not convinced it was wolves howling that night after listening to the sounds that I've heard on the internet, though. But I'm not for sure. Fast forward to this year, I ended up going back up to the trail by myself to do a solo hike. On the second day, I decided to stay on the trail instead of hike on the road to the same campsite. When I got to the same section of trail nearest the campsite from the year before, there was a notice on the trail map, sign saying there was a wet area that has formed and been there for the past several years to take a detour through a different trail. We haven't had much rain this year, so I thought it would be dried up, so I still continued on the trail to the wet area. When I got there, it was literally a swamp. This is also the area closest to the campsite the trail gets to, and would have been the direction most of the activity was coming from the year before. I attempted to get through the marsh, but I couldn't get very far until I decided to turn around and take the detour. As soon as I turned around, though, I heard that unforgettable tree knock that I had heard the year before. I pretended like I didn't hear it and continued back to the detour and followed the detour through. The detour was about 3/4 of a mile and was the most isolated part of the trail with the thickest forest I had ever been in. During that 3/4 of a mile, I heard 4 more tree knocks from different pitches like before, as if it were from separate logs making the noises. Once I left the detour and got out of that section of trail, I never heard anything again and finished the trail the next morning with no problems. Today's 6th encounter. My roommate, a guy we'll call Jim, spent his high school years in a little town in eastern Wyoming. I can't recall the name of the town, but it was the kind of place that most people had forgotten about since the trains had stopped coming through. It was a very weird little town, and most of the people living there seemed to be very paranoid. A lot of parents wouldn't let their children out to play outside after dark, and all unfamiliar faces were regarded with suspicion. Since the town was miles away from the nearest McDonald's or movie theater or shopping mall, there was nothing for young people to do but get shit-faced drunk. That's what Jim and his friends were planning to do on the night that this story takes place. A fellow classmate was having a kegger at his parents' house that night, which was 20 miles out of town on a dirt road somewhere. Jim had reservations about driving out there in the dark, because the general area was known to be sort of creepy at night, but his friends really wanted to go, and he was the only one with a car, so after some coaxing, Jim and about 5 of his friends pile into his Buick and head out of town. About half an hour later, they realize that they're lost. They can't find the road that they were supposed to turn on, and it's too dark to read any of the signs. They haven't seen any houses or cars for a while, so they figure they must have taken a wrong turn somewhere and decide to head back to the main road. After turning the car around and driving in the opposite direction for a few miles, Jim spots something in the middle of the road up ahead. His friend in the passenger seat notices it at the same time and says, "What the hell is that, dude?" At first they can't tell what they're looking at, but as the car draws nearer to the big black shape in the middle of the road, it starts to look like a mass of fur. Jim thinks it must be some sort of animal, but it looks big enough to do damage to his car, so he slows down and stops the car about 20 feet away from this thing. At this point, it's completely illuminated by his headlights, but neither he or his passengers can figure out what the hell kind of animal this is. Since it hasn't moved, they assume it must be dead and start to argue over who will drag it to the side of the road. That's when the thing starts to move. They all fell silent and watch as it stirs, then suddenly stands up. Jim would also preface that the next part of the story with, "I know this sounds crazy, but," He says he can't really describe what he saw because he had never seen anything like it before. The closest he can come is this. The thing, whatever it was about 7 feet tall when it rose to its full height. Its body was shaped like a human male, but it was covered with thick, dark fur. The head, he said, I watched the goosebumps break out on his arms as he said it. It was not human. It almost looked like a jackal or a German shepherd with a long snout and pointed ears, and its eyes were glowing in the headlights the way a cat's eyes sometimes glow. It was staring right at us. Jim doesn't know how long he stared back at this thing before he noticed that it was clutching a dead rabbit in one of its enormous paws/hands. He had barely had time to register this bit of information when the creature suddenly flung the dead rabbit away and took a step toward the teenagers in the car. Everyone screamed, and Jim slammed the car into reverse, made a U-turn, and got the hell out of there. Needless to say, the kids didn't make it to the party that night. Tonight's final encounter is going to be a reptilian encounter. On the 31st of August, 1968, 3 hunters had an experience of a lifetime. They encountered a reptilian humanoid and its spacecraft. The encounter took place at around 4 p.m. near Valencia, Spain, at the mountain range of La Yesta. The 3 hunters, all around the age of 50, had stopped to prepare lunch near a gorge. While preparing food, they noticed some kind of flash in the sky. They didn't think much of it. They were very down to earth and had no interest or knowledge of UFOs or aliens. A few moments later, one of the group, Mato Chover, walked toward the edge of the gorge to urinate. He left his gun and belt on the ground and stood at the edge. Mato looked at the other side of the gorge and at about the distance of 100 meters saw what could only be described as a humanoid being. The humanoid had gray skin, was muscular and well built, had a reptilian head, 2 red eyes, and claw-like hands. On one of his claws he held a transparent helmet featuring a white visor. Also, Mato noticed that the humanoid had a cat-like tail that touched the ground. The being wore a white overall and white boots. On his back he carried a metallic box measuring 1/2 meter and featuring a black antenna on the top. The being stood under a tree and gave the impression, according to the witness, that he was waiting for someone. Also, although the witness cannot be 100% sure due to the distance, the being seemed to have a forked tongue that would stick out once in a while. Mato kept looking while hiding between some rosemary bushes. He signaled to his friends to come close to him. In silence, accustomed to walking in silence so as not to scare off animals, his friends approached him. Amazed by what they saw, the 3 friends observed the being together for about 3 minutes. Suddenly, at the height of about 10 meters above the tree under which the being hovered, a black metallic cylindrical object. The object was on the horizontal position and completely silent, static. It measured about 30 meters in width and 10 meters in diameter. At this moment, they were completely terrified. Was this species invading Spain? They fell on the floor and crawled away to try to hide better between the bushes. After 2 minutes, they heard a loud and short sound similar to that of machinery. Once again, a flash appeared in the sky. When they were sure that the humanoid and UFO had gone, they felt more comfortable and started to investigate the area. They eventually crossed the gorge and reached the tree under which the humanoid stood for a few minutes. The tree's branches and some of the leaves appeared to be burned or charred. The area smelled of sulfur. On the soft ground they found several large footprints, size 50/16 in the United States, of a smooth sole. Also, they estimated that the being had to weigh about 150 kilos and probably stood at the height of 2.2 meters. They noticed that the being's head almost touched the lower branches of the tree. They finished their investigation by approaching a cave, thinking that maybe the being had come from there. At the scene, they realized that it was impossible due to the thick brush that covered the entrance. In a state of disbelief and shock, they walked back to their motorcycles. On the way, they met two policemen. They explained their experience. The policemen did not take note, and after listening to their testimony, just said, "In the lands, this is normal. Other people have seen them." Alright guys, like I said in the beginning, I had a very interesting upload with not a lot, but a couple of very different encounters, ranging from a calf being found in the tree with no reasonable explanation to some very creepy canine cryptids and some very creepy Sasquatch encounters, and then a reptilian encounter from Spain in 1968. I've heard that story a couple of times and wanted to share it. I know a lot of people, some people kind of look down on people when they talk about encounters with cryptids like Bigfoot, Dogman, reptilians, when UFOs are involved, but I don't think there's a reason for anyone to talk down on anyone in this field. You know, anything is possible, and once you start thinking that it is impossible, then that's when shit gets real, and you start to learn real quick that it is all possible. So yeah, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed today's upload as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. And until tomorrow, I'm going to bid you all farewell and see ya!